Our final speaker on the panel is Donna Murch, Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University and a scholar with a vibrant voice both in the academy and in the popular media. Her teaching and research specializations include historical studies of mass incarceration, the war on drugs, Black power and civil rights, social movements, and post-war US cities. Her newest book, Assata Taught Me, State Violence, Racial Capitalism, and the Movement for Black Lives, will be released next month from Haymarket Books. In October 2010, Professor Murch published the award-winning monograph, Living for the City, Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, with the University of North Carolina Press. It won the prestigious Phyllis Wheatley Prize in December 2011. Currently, she's completing a new trade press book titled Crack in Los Angeles, Policing the Crisis and the War on Drugs. Professor Murch has contributed to dozens of different academic journals and major newspapers, including the Sunday Washington Post, The Guardian, The New Republic, Jacobin, Black Scholar, Souls, the Journal of Urban History, and numerous others. She has appeared on BBC, CNN, and Democracy Now!, and both she and her research feature in Stanley Nelson's documentary, Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution. Her talk today is titled The March to Save America, Black Radicalism and the Specter of Racial Fascism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Murch to the virtual podium.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I only wish that I could have been there in person. So today's talk is in many ways a foray into the history of the present. I prepared my remarks after the recent anniversary of the attack on the Capitol last January 6th, as thousands of Trump supporters, many of them armed with guns, clad in military fatigues and gas masks, broke into the Senate chamber to try and stop congressional certification of the Electoral College votes, which would allow the president-elect at the time, Joe Biden, to become Donald Trump's successor. Wearing red Make America Great Again hats, carrying American flags, they shattered the windows on the first floor to climb through unmasked to interrupt the political process. Calling themselves patriots and citing the American Revolution, they rushed into the Capitol Rotunda, broke into congressional offices, and occupied the building. One man took up resident and Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office and put his feet up on the desk with his face showing no fear at all of arrest. He felt it was his due. Others proudly carried the Confederate flag to signify explicit white supremacy and support for the institution of slavery. Others posed in the vice presidential seat in the chamber. Many were taking selfies, some with police. Their sack of the Capitol was not rushed, fearful, or furtive. As right-wing protesters, composed overwhelmingly of white men, invaded the congressional floor, there was no law enforcement in sight. And as this unfolded on national television, many asked, where are the police? In a country armed to the teeth, in which it is common to see military-grade equipment, tanks, CS gas, rubber bullets deployed against peaceful protesters, we all wondered how this was possible. Since 2005, US police have shot and killed over 5,400 people, many for simply existing, playing with a toy, or walking down the street. Others have had the life choked out of them for selling stray cigarettes on the street or sleeping in their cars. One police officer even opened the gate so that Trump loyalists could pass more easily into the interior. This action, in fact, symbolized the whole event, in which segments of law enforcement, whose leadership and rank and file are some of Trump's strongest base of support, clearly allowed this to happen, and in some cases were inseparable from it. Over 1 million people in the United States work for the carceral state, including all levels of law enforcement, border patrol and immigrant detention, prison guards and custodians, police intelligence units, and private security. Even after the mob attack, the congressional session resumed. 121 Republicans still voted to decertify the electors in an effort to overturn President-elect Biden's victory. So what does this all mean? I would like to use this paradoxical spectacle in which a white mob that defines itself as patriots and protectors of the republic while using violence to stop the core processes of democracy as parable to think about racial fascism. Among American intellectuals, there's been a vibrant debate about whether or not we should consider Trump a fascist. The strongest advocates of calling Trump a fascist have been liberal intellectuals who see Trump as an awful aberration that stands outside the rest of American history, whose real kinship is with Hitler and the Nazi Party, or with contemporary Hungarian or Polish fascist anti Semites. Some see this as a bridge that links him to Russia and its oligarchs. In this view, the Republican Party is understood as having fallen victim to a populist coup that has forced them to simply keep their mouths shut and embrace Trumpism to ensure a political future. Among both the liberal establishment and the centrist wing of the Democratic Party, this view has a certain utility. If Trump is a dictator like Putin or a European-style fascist, then we all simply need to come together and become part of the, quote, resistance. We need to all form a popular front as we did in the 1930s, albeit while silencing and systematically disempowering the left, as seen in 2016 and 2020. If we can expunge the horror of Trump, the monster, the dictator, the Moscow dupe, then we can simply return to the world as it was, and all will be well. For many centrist leaders of the Democratic Party, this view has led them to redeem Republican presidents from years past, including George W. Bush, who is now often spoken of as a friend of Michelle Obama. He is seen as a more principled Republican of a better era, rather than the enabler of the longest war in American history in Afghanistan, the Second Gulf War, the War on Terror, and the torture memos. Compared to Trump, even George W. Bush is made to look good. In a country as inward-looking as the US, that understands itself as a shining city on the hill, the need to define Trump as foreign is not accidental. It is more palatable to see Trump and Trumpism as external to our quote-unquote exceptional democratic traditions. Much of this debate hinges on analogies to Europe of the interwar years. However, in my talk, I'd like to move past this logic to talk about the US and its history of what Black radical thinkers have called racial fascism. This is the context in which Trumpism should be understood and also fought and opposed. So I want to make three major points. I'll first mention them and then go into greater detail on each one. The first is that we need to shift the focus on fascism in public discourse in the United States from the interwar years in Europe to the particulars of the US and the rest of the Atlantic world, shaped by dual processes of settler colonialism and African slavery. The second point is to think less about Trump the man and more about Trumpism as a political phenomena, with 74 million in the US supporting him, who will be here long after he is gone. The third is to talk about the way forward, which people, organizations, and policies prescriptions are real opposition to this deluge of right-wing violence and Trumpism. Unfortunately, we are in a very dangerous moment in our history, not only because the alignment of the far right and institutional right of the Republican Party, but also because of the way this is strengthening the most conservative wing of the Democratic Party, making it more difficult to push through true redistributive social democratic policies that are essential to thwarting right-wing authoritarianism. If we move away from the politics of analogy, from understanding fascism primarily through the lens of Europe in the interwar years, and instead look to American past and present as the incubator of what poet and activist Amiri Baraka called racial fascism, we have the most immediate context for understanding the most dangerous forces of reaction. Here I am drawing on the important insights of Gabrielle Wynant and Albert Toscano. The tragic comic events of 2021 have provided us with an absurd taste of this violent history as a bare-chested man in animal skins posed for selfies outside the Senate chamber wearing a police vest. Interestingly, he was later revealed to be the son of a rabbi and Brooklyn Supreme Court judge. Pushing against the idea that Nazism is without precedent, Black radical thinkers have long fought to expand the imagination of the anti-fascist left to understand fascism as a continuation of colonial dispossession and racial slavery. In the 1930s, Pan Africanist intellectual George Padmore split with the Communist International for its failure to understand the linkages between democratic imperialism and fascism. Similarly, the great anti colonial poet Aimé Césaire argued that fascism was the quote, boomerang effect of European imperialist violence. In the 1930s, these Black thinkers from different parts of the world refused to see European fascism as new and instead linked it to the violent processes of expansion and conquest. Decades later, the poet and activist Amiri Baraka likened the overthrow of Reconstruction in the US to racial fascism. In the decades after the Civil War, terror was used to strip Black people of their citizenship rights and impose conditions that many described as worse than slavery in the late 19th century US. Half a century before the rise of Hitler, tens of thousands of Black and Native people were killed by forced labor, convict leasing, lynching, and systematic campaigns of rape and sexualized violence against women and children, all predicated on the idea that white is right and that the American soil is virgin land. One of the most important elements to understand about this history is that in the 20th century, in 20th century Europe, fashion is often understood as a break or an enemy of liberal democracy as its antagonist. But in the United States, throughout most of our history, racialized fascism has actually coexisted with the birth and advance of our democratic institutions. In fact, many would argue that it was the precondition that allowed the United States to become a place for upward mobility and realization of freedoms for its white settler population. This is why race and so-called identity politics has such deep and profound meaning in the US. It has always had a strong material base throughout the country's past and present. In South Africa, the term inherent folk democracy was used to describe this bifurcated form of governance, also known as master race democracy. The idea was that democracy was the province of a small white settler population that enjoyed steady expansions of democratic rights and the lifting of property-based suffrage restriction, while the Black majority found itself constricted by the bounds of racial apartheid. And this is taken from George Friedrichsen, who was writing about the history of South Africa, but in a comparative context, reinterpret the US through this idea. In the US, of course, the demographics were inverted. The white population made up the overwhelming majority, with African Americans, Latinos, and Native people as so-called racial minorities. So why does inherent folk democracy and racial fascism matter for our contemporary moment? In order to answer this question, I'll move to talking about some of the causes and how we've gotten to January 6th. There are a number of reasons, both political and economic, why we have over 74 million people in the United States, roughly 40% of our electorate supporting Trumpism. I'll touch on a few that I think are the most important. It is clear that right-wing populism and authoritarianism is a global phenomena with its own transnational linkages and shared sense of inertia. Nevertheless, it is crucial that we look to the histories of each individual country to try to understand the dynamics that are driving it domestically. So in the United States in the 1960s, we saw a dismantling of the core institutions of inherent folk democracy. The passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act in 1965 guaranteed all African Americans full citizenship rights, including the right to vote. And the important thing about this, and thinking about the fight today for voting rights, was that the idea that the federal government would step in and force states and municipalities to remove suffrage restriction. Please note how recent this is. It has only been 57 years in the United States since we've had true representative democracy. This expansion of the franchise overturned the system of inherent folk democracy, which had existed throughout US history, with a brief respite in the 10 years following the American Civil War and Reconstruction. During the era of racial segregation and Jim Crow, the South was a one-party state in which the Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy. However, When the Voting Rights Act was passed, then enforced through the might of the federal government, the Democratic Party became the party of racial liberalism that incorporated the overwhelming majority of the Black population and other vulnerable groups. It is at this point that white voters throughout the United States began to migrate into the Republican Party that had actually opposed the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, including future American presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. It is a difference in degree, not kind. So, what are the consequences of this? No Democratic president in the United States has been elected with a majority of the white vote since Lyndon Johnson. In this sense, the white majority following Trump is in keeping with the previous Republican presidents. He is not an aberration, but the continuation of politics of racial reaction inside the Republican Party. These political conditions cannot be understood without attending to American political economy of the last 50 years. So the United States is, of course, going through a period of rapid downward mobility, falling standard of living, with extreme polarization, upward redistribution of wealth. All the United States population is being affected, with Black, Brown, and Native populations suffering double and triple the rates of job loss, eviction, homelessness, and death rates from COVID-19. Nevertheless, for large segments of the white population, this condition is deeply destabilizing, and it is conjoined with a larger sense of imperial decline that is unbearable because many white Americans do think their country is exceptional. And the idea that it is not is profoundly wounding. It is in this context that we can understand the Make America Great Again movement how it has won the hearts and minds of 74 million Americans and the overwhelming majority of the white population class. An important fact lies behind this, which is that up until the 1970s, the white population saw steady growth in its income and wealth throughout the trajectory of American history. This was the material base of the so-called American dream, a term coined quite recently in the Great Depression. However, it is in this period of oil shocks and stagflation in the 1970s that we begin to see workers' salaries flatline and a slow descent into deunionization of large sectors of the American economy. With anti-union policies, the unionized workforce has shrunk to between 5 and 7%, most of which is in the public sector, which is disproportionately Black and brown. The neoliberal politics of deregulation, combined with the loss of manufacturing, means that well-paid working-class jobs are scarce, and the kind of social mobility that has been the core of the white experience in the US is more and more out of reach. People have talked about this also in terms of the recent finding about the increase in death rates among white working class Americans from so-called deaths of despair. In the increasingly bleak fortunes of the US, with both parties committed to privileging market growth, Wall Street, and massive cuts and privatization of the most important public goods, including public universities, libraries, transit systems, public hospitals, and healthcare, leading to rapid downward mobility for many. The second is to move the discussion away from Trump the man to focus instead on the forces that helped to produce him and the 74 million people supporting him. One of the most terrifying things about this moment is not just Trump the man, but how long Trumpism will likely persist and I fear thrive. No doubt this form of politics will be a force in the United States, not only in our lifetimes, but in that of our children. I fear that Trumpism and American authoritarianism and right-wing violence will continue to grow and metastasize in the next years and beyond. So what are its core elements? First, an intensified racism and white power politics that repudiate even marginal acknowledgement of both basic civil and human rights of non-white people and migrant populations, and the consistent gutting of the Voting Rights Act. You might remember that when Trump was elected in 2016, 1/5 of his supporters who were surveyed said slavery of Black populations should be reinstated. Illiberal attacks on and attempts to dismantle democratic institutions, the mass selling off of public goods and public lands, so-called eco-fascism. One of the most egregious acts were the selling of drilling rights in the Arctic in the final days of the Trump presidency. Hypermilitarism, fusing capital with the executive branch of government by appointing heads of industry to the presidential cabinet, For example, appointing Rex Tillerson of BP, Secretary of State Alex Azar, the head of the former head of Eli Lilly US as Secretary of Health and Human Services to disastrous effect in both the opioid crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. A program of unilateral economic and political nationalism. I could go on. So what we are facing is quite daunting. If the Democratic Party does not take decisive action to overturn the filibuster and offer an aggressive politics of social welfare, universal health coverage, funding of public infrastructure, and an explicit challenge to the politics of resentment that Trump embodies, US is going to travel down a very dark road in which our politics will move further and further right with disastrous consequences. The real antidote to this kind of proto-fascist authoritarianism in the US is an explicit anti-racist social democracy with radical organizing outside the electoral sphere. Both matter. If this does not happen, the United States is going to become more and more unstable and to march steadily to the right, not only to our peril inside the US, but perhaps even more so for the rest of the world. I fear the US will increasingly use its military might to enforce its economic interests as it experiences a steady economic and imperial decline. The growing anti-Chinese sentiment articulated not only by Trump and the Republicans, but among many Democrats, is growing worse. Trumpism has opened the door into a new era of American politics that shows the power of using explicit white supremacy, political violence, and spectacle to attack the core principles of democratic governance in the United States. And in doing so, he has toppled the previous leadership of the Republican Party and energized a mass base among white voters cross-class. They are not the poor and dispossessed. The average Trump voter in 2016 made a per capita income of $76,000. Another important point is that the kind of racial appeal made by Trumpism is different in kind, not in degree, from the Republicans that have come before. And here I wanted to emphasize that when Donald Trump visited Sanford, Florida, where Trayvon Martin was killed, and it's, of course, that killing of Trayvon Martin that becomes the catalytic spark for the movement for Black Lives. So Trump publicized this visit to Sanford, Florida, in the same way that Ronald Reagan visited Philadelphia, Mississippi in his electoral campaign in 1980 to signify going to the place where the bodies of 3 murdered civil rights workers were found. And in doing that, he went there, he talked about states' rights, and he was making a direct connection between white supremacist violence and his election. While we don't like to say this out loud, many of us fear that in the very near future, a next generation of far-right leader will emerge, who are not hobbled by Trump's epic laziness, incompetence, and obvious psychological distress. The names Tucker Carlson and Tom Cotton have been mentioned, but of course there are others. The fear is that a politician more talented than Trump will be able to realize the erratic blueprint that Trump has provided, but without the hindrance of incompetence. So in the final section of my talk, I just want to emphasize that there are very strong counter tendencies to the kind of authoritarian proto-fascism that we see in Trump. They don't come from the infrastructure of the Democratic Party, but rather they draw from the successive social movements that have swept the country over the last decades. The United States is truly polarizing, not only in terms of wealth inequality, but also political divergence. The most exciting development of the past decade is watching the resurgence of young radicals inside the US, ranging from the BYP 100 in Chicago, the Dream Defenders in Florida, and the many partners in the movement for Black Lives, as well as the growth of the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, in cities throughout the US. A post-Cold War generation of people under 40 are actively identifying as socialists and as prison abolitionists, and they have contributed to the largest protest movement in total numbers in America in 2020. The estimates are that during the George Floyd protests in the summer of 2020, between 5 and 7 million people participated, distributed throughout 40% of the counties in the United States. That number, actually, the upward number that I've seen cited in the New York Times is 26 million. The movement for Black Lives has created its own mix of Black radical ideas, which speak to the urgent needs of the present. As Black female organizers have ascended to the forefront of the struggle against state violence and mass incarceration, they have drawn on registers of the Black radical tradition that link anti racist and anti capitalist critique to a queer feminist lens. External struggles against state violence are seen as inseparable from internal battles within family and community, as gender, queer, and trans equity are understood as essential to the 21st century conception of Black liberation. BLM's politicization of Black life through mass protests against police killings has been crucial to building and expanding the movement for prison and police abolition, which seeks to divest carceral institutions of state monies and to reinvest those resources in redistributive social services. Organizing outside the domain of electoral politics is crucial, however. It is important to note that there is evidence that the large BLM mobilizations help increase Democratic turnout. When you look at the electoral map in the places where the Democrats won, they were areas that had seen massive protests and organizing drives, including Arizona, Minnesota, Michigan, and Georgia, whose electoral win was fueled by grassroots electoral organizing. Ultimately, the most effective way to fight right-wing violence and reaction is via independent organizing of Black and Brown populations, dismantling the carceral state, whose more than 1 million strong workforce serve as the shock troops for the right, a revived union movement of the kind we are seeing in teacher strikes across the country and among Amazon workers during the pandemic. In this fight, Black Lives Matter has emerged as a powerful optic for large portions of the population who are explicitly repudiating the violent politics of white supremacy and misogyny that Trump represents and looking towards a future of Black liberation and joy as a collective project. While the near term is quite bleak, if current voting trends continue of younger populations, the decades to come offer the possibility of real change and thwarting of the United States far right, including evangelical Christians, the militias, and QAnon. So the first place to look for how the battle against Trumpism is the movement for Black lives and the fight to roll back mass incarceration. The second is the vibrancy of the climate justice movement. The minister that most of the left is most excited about is Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior, the first Native cabinet pick in history. I'd like to read a quote from Standing Rock activist Winona LaDuke about the significance of her appointment. Quote, the emotional outpouring arose from a people who have internalized their brutal place in US history, betrayal, wars, massacres, stolen lands, and a forced death march of nearly 50,000 people for thousands of miles from the South to the Midwest, where they were sequestered on assigned land. On top of all of that, children were often required to attend re-education camps where instructors severed them from their native tongues and culture. With so little political representation in federal government over nearly 2.5 centuries since the United States became a nation, Indigenous people were astonished that a woman who spoke a native language and grew up on tribal land might finally represent them in the presidential candidate. It is very clear that this happened because of the organization of the climate justice movement, which is one of the most important unifying threads through many tendencies of the left. The final force that will play an essential role is the revived labor movement. Over the past 2 years, we have seen a real expansion of labor, not only in historically blue democratic states, but also at the core of Trump territory in the teacher strikes in West Virginia, Oklahoma, that are bridged with the Chicago Teachers Union. They're actively fighting against the privatization of public services and goods, using bargaining for the common good strategies, making common alliance with parents, and rebuilding the union movement. The real antidote for right-wing authoritarianism in the US is an explicit anti-racist social democratic policy that shows Americans that there is a place for government resources to change people's lives. There is a historical precedent for this in the 60s under Lyndon Johnson. Left and radical movements thrived and expanded under a Democratic president. The social upheaval that accompanied the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to reflect on the transformative years of protest and urban rebellion in our recent past. The massive demonstrations that swept the United States in the spring and summer of 2020 prompted comparisons to the long, hot summers of civil rights and Black Power. Strikingly, the total numbers of participants in 2020 are exponentially larger, leading historian Barbara Ransby to argue the fire this time is hotter. The Black Lives Matter movement reminds us that Black freedom and the struggle of elder generations are the archive that continually informs the horizon of possibility today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Murch, for helping us to end with a level of hope and possibility. I'd like to invite our speakers who are here to join me at the podium for just a moment, and we'll do a question or two before the coffee break. And then we'll be able to continue the conversation in the days ahead. So Professor Mammone, Professor Woolley, if you'd rejoin me. I'm going to exercise my moderator's privilege and ask the first question, but then if you'd like to come up to the mic to ask a question, please do. Okay. On now? Can you hear me? Hello. Okay, now we're in business. So that was such a rich panel with so many overlaps and keywords that came to the fore. I was writing down things about mainstreaming, the questions of legitimization, the questions of attention, of how you sort of maintain attention on these things that are very distasteful to watch. But I wanted to ask you all a question of perspective, of positionality, because I think your research is getting at the question of the position from which to do this kind of work, the sort of transnational thrust of a lot of your research. I'm wondering if it's easier to see these questions in the comparative perspective, if it's easier to see them abroad, if it's easier to see them when you're looking at places close to home, and how you position yourself also in terms of resistance when you think historically, politically, institutionally about the place from which you do this really challenging research. And I think Professor Woolley, with your ethnographies, I imagine that question of positionality is front and center. But I wonder if you would like to comment on that briefly.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's working. Yeah, the question about positionality is a crucial one, as in my case, when I do ethnographic research, and it takes a long time to come in contact with these members, with these groups, and then developing a phase where you have to prove that you are a scholar who does not judge the positions of these actors. And with the time, you start to learn these persons, these individuals, and it is difficult to not to interfere with your own values. On the other side, it is also difficult because you understand their problems, you understand the motivations that drive them to a political engagement. And at the same time, for example, in the research with Pegida, I was there every Monday for 4 months, and I understood how they created a community. Monday after Monday, they were creating a community, starting with chants, starting with singing traditional songs. And from the one side, you see the community creating under your eyes, and the very next moment, you see that this community rejects other communities, like the ones of migrants or politicians or the media. So there is a kind of difficulties in observing and then going back home and writing the ethnographic notes. And then about transnationalism. Well, I started making research of this kind in Germany and then in Italy. So this helped me a lot in order to develop a kind of approach where the variables, the classic political science variables, mix up with other cultural variables in a way where the approach to the observation and the approach to the theory has been helped with regards to these two different historical approaches to fascism, to Italian fascism, and to the national socialism in Germany. These two historiographical perspectives are different, and they reproduce themselves in the way that research has been made. But on the other side, the convergence I talked about is a convergence where political science or political variables really mix up with the cultural settings and the cultural variables I was talking about.
Okay, well, I think that you raise an interesting point, how to see this and how to get eventually involved or not involved. What I can say is that when I look at things personally, from a transnational global perspective, it's of course easier to analyze patterns, similarities, or differences because I'm very distant from the object that I observe. But when I do some research, let's say from below, then it depends what we are talking about. Because growing up in Italy, I have tons of friends who are still believe. They perceive themselves as fascists, and when I talk with them, they they are not even racist or so, but I need to understand that they come from a family tradition, which is that one. So they've never seen anything outside of that. So sometimes, as Georgia was saying, there are people with motivations, with fears, and if we just label them, not necessarily we understand what is going on. In terms of resistance to this, I think that we need to challenge this right-wing idea that us as intellectual, as academics, cannot have our ideas and we cannot talk publicly about them. We're not paid obviously by political parties. So even if I'm on the left, I can teach properly contemporary history without being affected. While there is, this external idea that, okay, this is communist, he is a left-winger, so he cannot teach, he cannot do research. It depends if you are a militant or not. But, many of the people writing on the newspapers that I know, they don't belong to political parties. So I think that there is a need, especially today, to have a sort of civic resistance to some of this, because we're not talking about fringes anymore. We're talking about mainstream forces. So what, the book that I mentioned before, made by a friend as well, I have to say, is making the other point, is saying, if we call them fascists, this is not fair, this is not true. Fascism was in the past, and there is radical Islam, and then there is Antifa, they have to be considered as well. So, you academics, you fellow academics are doing a very bad job. But at the end of the day, when you see, people storming the Capitol Hill or kidnapping or attempting to kidnap, well, or you are on a side of the story or you are on another side, or you, as in the past, you sign a manifesto for fascism or you refuse to it, but at some point other people will study you and will consider if you were on the side of fascism or on the side of democracy. There is nothing in the middle.
Thank you. Professor Murch, is she still with us?
I am.
Yes, would you like to mention or talk about your thoughts about positionality and where the place from which you do your work?
Yeah, thank you for that. This kind of analysis in some ways is a break with what I've done in the past. Most of my career has been devoted to studying Black left movements. And in some ways, I could have given a talk about the uses of violence on the left. But as was said by my fellow presenter, I think there is a moment now where all of us have to turn our attention and organize against this. In terms of positionality, I do think that figuring out how to organize transnationally using the resources that are available to the university is extremely important because certainly the right is organizing internationally across borders. I recently watched an awful documentary that left me sleepless for 3 days called The Brink, and it was about Stephen Bannon flying to different countries in Europe and trying to knit together this kind of international coalition of fascists. So I think this is a time for internationalism. I would also say that it is also important to do the national and local analysis to try to understand the social history and social composition of these movements. And I think we need more work on that in the United States. So much of the discourse in the US is about the horror of Trump. And if we could just get rid of Trump, then we could go back to business as usual. And so I think in the case of the US, we also need a kind of self-critical analysis that doesn't only look at the international connections, but looks at really the politics of the last 50 years and how we've ended up with 74 million people supporting him. That said, we can look at the footage of Charlottesville with holding the tiki torches saying they will not replace us, being in direct dialogue with things that are happening in Hungary and Poland. So I think both are needed.
Thank you so much to all of you. I fear that we are out of time for the moment.